Upon going to the garden of his mansion, the millionaire was paralyzed when he met his new gardener. She wore the same pendant he gave his daughter before she disappeared 19 years ago. The morning sun stretched lazily over the Carter estate, its golden rays filtering through the thick canopy of trees that lined the grand property. The gardens, lush and meticulously maintained, were a masterpiece of color and fragrance. Roses, tulips, and orchids thrived under the careful hands of the estate's gardeners, painting the landscape with soft hues of pink, white, and red. A gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of jasmine through the air, creating an almost surreal sense of peace. Ethan Carter strode down the stone pathway, his polished shoes clicking softly against the smooth surface. His tailored suit, though impeccable as always, felt heavier today. It always did on mornings like this, mornings when his mind wandered back to that night. It had been 19 years since Emily disappeared, yet the wound had never healed. Time had done nothing to ease the gnawing pain in his chest, the crushing weight of guilt that sat on his shoulders like a ghost. He had searched, spent millions on investigators, detectives, even psychics in his most desperate moments, and still, nothing but a hollow life built on power, money, and loneliness. As he reached the eastern section of the garden, something unusual caught his eye. A young woman kneeling near the hydrangeas, carefully pruning the bushes with an expertise that suggested years of experience. She wore simple work jeans, a loose button-up shirt, and gardening gloves. Her chestnut brown hair pulled back in a low ponytail. A few strands had escaped, falling gently across her face, which was slightly flushed from the morning sun. Ethan rarely paid attention to the estate's employees. They came and went, tending to his property, keeping things running smoothly. He preferred solitude, found little use for small talk. But today, something felt different. Then, in a single moment, everything stopped. His gaze landed on it, a silver butterfly pendant, delicate and shining softly against her collarbone. It swayed gently with her movements, catching the sunlight, and Ethan forgot how to breathe. His feet felt rooted to the ground. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, a deafening rhythm that drowned out everything else. He knew that pendant, every detail of it, every. He had held it in his hands when he had given it to Emily on her 5th birthday. It couldn't be. It was impossible. And yet, there it was. The air around him suddenly felt suffocating. His fingers clenched into fists as he fought to steady his breathing. A coincidence, his logical mind argued. It has to be. But another voice, buried deep in his soul, whispered something else. It whispered hope. "Excuse me." His voice came out rougher than intended. The woman startled slightly before turning her head. Her eyes met his, warm, deep brown, but carrying a quiet sorrow. Ethan's stomach clenched. There was something familiar about her. "Yes, sir," she replied, standing up and wiping her hands on her gardening gloves. Her voice was soft but steady. For a moment, Ethan struggled to find his words. He gestured toward the pendant, his throat dry. "That necklace," he finally managed, keeping his tone measured. "Where did you get it?" The young woman? Lauren? He vaguely recalled hearing that name mentioned. Instinctively reached for the pendant, fingers grazing the butterfly as if it were second nature. A small, almost self-conscious smile formed on her lips. "Oh, this," she said, glancing down at it. "I've had it for as long as I can remember. It's the only thing I had when I was adopted." Ethan's world tilted. A sharp inhale lodged in his chest. The world around him seemed to fade, the edges of reality blurring as a singular, devastating thought took hold. The only thing she had when she was adopted. The weight of those words pressed against his ribs. He swallowed hard, his mind racing to process what he had just heard. "How old were you?" His voice was tight, controlled, but his entire body was trembling. Lauren frowned slightly, as if confused by his sudden interest. 4, maybe. I don't really remember much before that," she admitted with a shrug. "They told me I was found alone on the side of a road." Ethan staggered back half a step, but to him, it felt like the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. This was insane. A twisted joke, a coincidence, but his gut knew better. For 19 years he had prayed for this moment, imagined it, begged for it. "Sir," Lauren's voice pulled him back. "Are you okay?" He forced a nod, though his hands were shaking. "Fine," he muttered, though it was a blatant lie. Nothing about this moment was fine. Lauren hesitated before dusting off her jeans. Well, I should get back to work. Ethan barely heard her. His mind was a storm, thoughts colliding in rapid succession. This couldn't be ignored. Not again. Not after so many years of nothing. There was only one way to be sure. As Lauren turned away, completely unaware of the hurricane raging inside him, Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He dialed a number, one he hadn't called in years. The line rang twice before a deep, familiar voice answered. "Andrews, I need you," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. A pause, then, "Need me for what?" Ethan exhaled slowly, eyes still locked on Lauren's retreating figure. "Find out everything you can about my new gardener." Another pause. "Your gardener?" "Yes," Ethan confirmed, his grip tightening around the phone. He inhaled deeply before saying the words that made his chest ache. "She might be my daughter." Ethan Carter stood frozen in place, staring at the now vacant spot where Lauren had been moments ago. His pulse was still hammering against his ribs, and his fingers, still gripping the phone, felt ice cold. He had spent 19 years living in a cycle of hope and disappointment. He had followed leads, hired the best investigators, scoured the world for a trace of Emily, and yet, every path had led to nothing. But now she had walked right into his home, into his garden. Or had she? His mind fought against the absurdity of it. This isn't real. It couldn't be. He had buried this hope years ago. But the moment he saw that pendant, the very same one he had held in his hands on Emily's 5th birthday, something inside him had cracked wide open, and Lauren's words had driven a stake through his chest. "I've had it for as long as I can remember. They told me I was found alone on the side of a road. The logic, the years of failed searches, the impossibility of it all. It no longer mattered, because deep down he knew. A voice on the other end of the call pulled him back. "You still there?" Andrew's voice was rough, laced with mild irritation. Ethan cleared his throat, forcing himself to focus. "Yes," he said, regaining control of his voice. "I need everything. Where she was born, who adopted her, where she lived before that." He exhaled slowly. "And I need it fast." There was a beat of silence before Andrews let out a dry chuckle. "Haven't heard from you in 5 years, and now you're calling me about your gardener." "Don't waste time," Ethan snapped, his patience razor thin. The investigator sighed. All right, I'll get started, but Carter, if this is what I think it is, you know there's a chance you're about to break your own heart." Ethan shut his eyes for a moment, like it isn't already broken. "I just need the truth," he muttered. "Find it." He ended the call before Andrews could say anything else. The truth. That's all he had ever wanted. The day Emily vanished, Ethan had been at a business dinner in Manhattan, finalizing a multi-million-dollar deal. His wife, God, Maria, had stayed home with her, preparing a bedtime story like she always did. When Maria stepped out of the room for just a moment, Emily had been there, and when she came back, she was gone, vanished. No sign of a break-in, no footprints, no witnesses, nothing. For the first few hours, the police had treated it like a case of a wandering child, a little girl who had probably woken up, gotten confused, and walked out of the house. But as time passed, the reality set in. Someone had taken her. For months, the police and FBI tore the city apart. Leads came in, but none led to Emily. Suspects were questioned, but there was no proof. And then, 1 year later, a crushed silver butterfly pendant had been found near a riverbed. Along with a tiny blood-stained sweater, the forensics report had been inconclusive. The case had gone cold, and Ethan's life had ended. Now, standing in the vast emptiness of his estate, those memories clawed at him like demons. Andrews would take days, maybe weeks, to find something concrete. But Ethan wasn't the kind of man to sit and wait. He needed answers now. With determined steps, he made his way back into the house. His mansion, with its marble floors, grand chandeliers, and opulent decor, had always felt like a monument to his failure. What was the point of all this wealth when the one thing that mattered had been stolen from him? He found himself in his office, his hand moving toward the drawer before he even realized what he was doing. When he pulled it open, his fingers brushed against a worn, old leather-bound book. He hesitated. then slowly picked it up. Emily's baby album. It was the only thing he had left of her that hadn't been packed away in grief. He turned the pages one by one, his throat tightening. Her first steps, her first Christmas, her first time at the beach. And then he stopped. A picture of Emily at 5 years old, wearing the very same pendant that was now around Lauren's neck. Ethan clenched his jaw. It has to be her. A knock at the door jolted him back to reality. He quickly shut the album, shoving it back into the drawer. "Come in." The door creaked open, and to his surprise, Lauren stepped inside, hesitating in the doorway. "Sorry to bother you," she said carefully, her gaze flickering around the office before landing on him. "I just wanted to check if everything was all right." "You looked," she hesitated, as if searching for the right word. "Troubled." Ethan forced himself to school his expression, though his mind was still reeling. "I'm fine," he said, though the words felt hollow. She hesitated. "If you need space, I understand. But if I said something earlier that upset you?" "You didn't," Ethan interrupted, his voice softer than before. Lauren studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, well, I'll be in the garden if you need anything." She turned to leave, and something in Ethan cracked. He couldn't let her just walk away, not before knowing. "Lauren?" She stopped, turning back. "Yeah." His pulse pounded. The question hovered on the edge of his tongue, begging to be asked. Had she ever, even once, had flashes of memories, a familiar scent, a dream of a woman's voice whispering, "Good night, my love"? Had she ever felt like something was missing? But he couldn't ask. Not yet. Instead, he exhaled slowly and said, "Thank you." Lauren blinked, clearly surprised. "For what?" He hesitated before shaking his head. "For taking good care of the garden." A small smile tugged at her lips. "Of course," she left, and Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He had to be sure. And when he had proof, nothing on this earth would stop him from telling her the truth. Ethan barely slept that night. He had spent hours pacing his study, staring at the old photographs of Emily, his mind an endless reel of memories and possibilities. His rational side warned him against getting his hopes up, against diving into another obsession that could break him all over again. But his heart had already decided. As dawn broke, he found himself by the window, watching the estate slowly come to life. The staff moved about, preparing for the day, but his gaze remained locked on one person, Lauren. She was in the garden again, her hands carefully tending to the flowers, completely unaware of the storm she had ignited in him. His phone buzzed on the desk behind him. He turned, snatching it up before the sound could finish. "Andrews?" he answered without preamble. "I've got the first pieces of information you asked for," the detective said. Ethan could hear the sound of shuffling papers in the background. Lauren Bennett, 23 years old, grew up in the foster system after being found abandoned on the side of a road at around 4 years old. No known biological relatives, no official birth records before that. Ethan's grip tightened around the phone. "And where exactly was she found?" Andrews sighed. "Upstate, a small town called Maplewood, remote, barely anything out there except forests and long stretches of road." Ethan's stomach twisted. He remembered the name. It was the same area where one of the last unconfirmed sightings of Emily had been reported. "She was taken to an orphanage?" he asked. "Yeah. St. Mary's Home for Children. Small place, not much funding. She stayed there until she was adopted at 7. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. And the adoption. Couple named Richard and Lisa Bennett. Decent folks. They lived in Brooklyn, worked regular jobs. No criminal history. No red flags. From what I've gathered so far, they raised her well. She moved out on her own at 18. Andrews paused. "Ethan, you realize that if this girl really is Emily, they had nothing to do with it, right?" "I know that," Ethan muttered. "But I need more." "I'm digging," Andrews assured him. "But I'll be honest. Someone worked hard to erase her past. There's no real documentation of her before she was found. No reports of missing children matching her description back then. It's like she just appeared out of nowhere." Ethan swallowed hard. "Because someone made sure of it." A long silence stretched between them. Andrews finally spoke again, his tone more cautious. "You think someone close to you was involved, don't you?" Ethan closed his eyes. He didn't want to say it out loud. didn't want to give the thought any more power than it already had. But deep down, he knew. He had suspected for years. "I need confirmation," he said instead. "DNA." Andrews exhaled. "That's tricky. You'll need a sample from her. Hair, saliva, blood, something you can send to a private lab." Ethan's mind was already racing. "I'll handle it." "All right," Andrews said. "I'll keep digging on my end. If I find anything else, I'll let you know." Ethan ended the call and let out a slow breath. His hands were trembling. This was real. This was happening. His eyes returned to the garden where Lauren was still working, completely unaware of the war raging inside him. A few minutes later, he stepped outside, the crisp morning air filling his lungs as he made his way toward her. She didn't notice him at first, too focused on the flower bed in front of her. "Lauren?" She looked up, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Mr. Carter?" She greeted politely. "Can I help you with something?" Ethan hesitated. He had no idea what to say to her, no idea how to get closer without raising suspicion. "You've been doing excellent work here," he said instead. She smiled, the smallest trace of surprise flickering in her eyes. "Thank you. I love working with plants. It's calming." Ethan nodded, watching her closely. "Have you always lived in New York?" Lauren hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "Mostly my parents moved here when I was little." "You were adopted?" "Right." His voice remained steady, but inside he was on edge. Lauren stiffened slightly, though she tried to hide it. "Yes," she said cautiously. "Why do you ask?" Ethan's chest tightened. He wanted to tell her everything, to ask her if she had ever had flashes of memories, of a different life, a different home, if she had ever felt like something was missing. Instead, he forced a small smile. "Just curious. It's rare to meet someone who was adopted and doesn't know where they originally came from." Lauren's fingers instinctively brushed the pendant around her neck. "I stopped wondering a long time ago," she admitted. "When I was younger, I used to ask questions, but no one had answers, so I just let it go." Ethan felt something twist in his gut. She had given up on her past because no one ever fought to find it. "Maybe the answers are still out there," he said carefully. Lauren let out a small, sad laugh. Maybe. Ethan knew then that he couldn't wait. He couldn't sit back and let Andrews handle it alone. He needed proof, and he needed it soon. As he walked back toward the house, his mind was already forming a plan. He needed something small, a hair, a used napkin, anything that he could send to the lab. And once he had the results, once he knew for sure, there would be no hiding from the truth anymore. Lauren Bennett was about to discover that she wasn't just a gardener. She was the daughter of Ethan Carter, and someone had stolen her life. Ethan spent the rest of the morning locked in his study, his mind racing as he tried to piece together the puzzle that had consumed his life for nearly 2 decades. Every instinct in his body screamed that Lauren was Emily, but instinct wasn't enough. He needed irrefutable proof. The DNA test was the only way. His gaze drifted to the glass of water sitting on his desk. If he could get Lauren to drink from a glass, if he could retrieve even a strand of her hair, anything, he could send it to a private lab. He had enough influence to get the results quickly, bypassing any bureaucratic red tape. But he had to be careful. If Lauren sensed his motives, she might pull away. A knock on the door snapped him out of his thoughts. He stiffened, expecting Lauren again. But when the door opened, a familiar figure stepped in. Rebecca. His sister's expression was one of practiced warmth, the kind she always wore in social gatherings, in high society events where appearances mattered more than sincerity. "Good morning, Ethan," she greeted smoothly, stepping inside without invitation. She was dressed impeccably, as always, her dark hair styled perfectly, her emerald green blouse pristine. "I heard from the staff that you've been spending quite a bit of time in the gardens lately." Ethan leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. "Is there a reason you're here, Rebecca?" She let out a soft chuckle, moving toward the bar cart to pour herself a glass of wine. It wasn't even noon. "Can't a sister check in on her dear brother?" she asked, though her voice was laced with something sharper. She took a sip, then turned to face him. "I also heard you've taken quite an interest in that new gardener, Lauren, isn't it?" Ethan's stomach twisted, but he kept his expression neutral. "I don't see why that would concern you." Rebecca tilted her head, studying him. "It concerns me when my brother, who barely speaks to anyone, suddenly fixates on a hired worker," she said, her tone light, but her eyes sharp. "And let me guess, you think she's her, don't you?" Ethan's jaw clenched. He had always known that Rebecca was perceptive, but the fact that she had figured it out so quickly made his skin crawl. "And if I do?" he challenged. Rebecca sighed, setting her glass down before walking toward him. "Ethan, I know you've never stopped looking for Emily," she said, her voice softer now, as if she were speaking to a grieving man rather than her brother. "I know you still blame yourself for what happened, but this," she gestured vaguely, "you're chasing ghosts. You can't keep doing this to yourself." Ethan stared at her. There was pity in her voice, carefully placed, expertly delivered. And if he were anyone else, he might have believed her concern was real. But he wasn't just anyone. He was her brother, and he knew exactly what she was capable of. "What if I'm not wrong?" he asked, keeping his voice measured. "What if she really is Emily?" Rebecca sighed dramatically, shaking her head. "Then where has she been all this time? Why now? Why here?" She leaned in slightly. "You're reaching, Ethan. You're seeing what you want to see, and it's dangerous." Dangerous. The word settled uncomfortably in his chest. He had been suspicious of Rebecca for years, but never had proof, never had anything solid enough to confront her. And yet, here she was, in his office telling him to let it go. Ethan folded his arms. "I've already started an investigation," he said. "If she's not Emily, I'll find out soon enough." Rebecca's expression flickered for the briefest second before she smiled, stepping back. "And if she isn't, will you finally stop this madness?" Ethan didn't answer, because deep down he knew, if Lauren wasn't Emily, then Emily was truly gone, and he wasn't ready to accept that. Rebecca let out a soft sigh and picked up her glass again. "I just want you to be careful, dear brother," she murmured. "Don't get your hopes up too high. The fall will be much worse." With that, she turned and walked toward the door, but before she left, she paused. "Oh, and Ethan," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm always here." Ethan watched as she disappeared down the hall. The moment she was gone, he let out a slow, measured breath. She knows something. The way she had pushed him to let go. The way she had tried to manipulate the conversation. It was all too deliberate, too calculated. And that meant one thing. Rebecca wasn't just hiding something. She was hiding everything. Ethan turned back toward his desk, his mind made up. He needed those DNA results. And when they came back, when the truth was finally in his hands, he would tear down every lie, every deception, every carefully constructed facade his sister had built. Because if Rebecca had been behind Emily's disappearance, then she was going to pay. Ethan Carter had never been a patient man. His success in business had been built on sharp instincts, fast decisions, and the ability to see through people. But this required a level of restraint he wasn't used to. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to act, to demand answers from Lauren, to confront Rebecca head-on, to force the truth into the light. But he couldn't. Not yet. He needed proof first. That evening, he found himself by the window of his study again, watching Lauren as she finished her work in the garden. The golden hues of the sunset cast a warm glow over her figure, highlighting the soft waves in her brown hair. She looked so at ease, so unaware of the storm that was beginning to form around her. Ethan clenched his fists. If she really was Emily, if Rebecca had been responsible for her disappearance, how much had been stolen from her? Her childhood, her family, her memories, everything, and she didn't even know it. That realization burned inside him like a wildfire. He needed to get closer to her, to learn more. A quiet knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see his butler, James, standing at the entrance as composed as ever. "Sir, dinner is ready," James announced, then hesitated before adding, "Shall I inform Miss Bennet as well?" Ethan's brows lifted slightly. "She eats with the staff, doesn't she?" "Typically, yes," James confirmed, "but considering your recent interest in her work, I assumed you might want to extend an invitation." Ethan exhaled slowly. It was a risk. If he moved too fast, she might become suspicious. But if he wanted to gain her trust, he needed to start somewhere. "Yes," he said finally. "Invite her." James nodded and disappeared down the hall. Ethan took a deep breath. This is the first step. 15 minutes later, Lauren entered the dining room, clearly hesitant. She had changed into a simple blouse and jeans, her hair still slightly damp from what was likely a quick shower after work. She looked uncertain, almost out of place in the grand setting of the Carter Estate's dining hall. "I wasn't expecting this," she admitted as she approached the long oak table. Where Ethan was already seated, he gestured to the seat across from him. "I thought it was time we had a conversation. You've been working here for a while now and we've barely spoken." Lauren hesitated before sitting down. "I just figured someone like you wouldn't be too interested in talking to the help." Ethan let out a small chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "I don't usually make a habit of it, but you're different." Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't press him on it. Instead, she unfolded her napkin and picked up her fork. For the next few minutes, silence stretched between them as they ate. The meal was exquisite. Seared salmon, roasted vegetables, and a light white wine sauce. But Ethan barely tasted it. His focus remained on Lauren, on the small details of her movements, her expressions. "You grew up in Brooklyn, right?" he asked casually. Lauren paused mid-bite before nodding. "Yeah, my adoptive parents, moved there when I was 7. Do you remember anything before that?" She set her fork down slowly, her posture shifting slightly. "Not really. Just bits and pieces, flashes, but nothing concrete." Ethan's heart pounded. "Like what?" Lauren frowned, as if trying to pull something from the depths of her mind. "I don't know. Sometimes I dream about a house. It's big with tall windows and a grand staircase. But I don't know if it's a real memory or just something my brain made up." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. His house. His old house. The one Emily had lived in before she was taken. He forced himself to keep his expression neutral. "That's interesting," he said evenly. Lauren gave a small shrug. "I used to ask about my past when I was a kid, but no one had answers. After a while, I just accepted that my life started at 4 years old, everything before that. It's like it never existed." Ethan tightened his grip on his glass. Because it had existed, someone had just erased it. He needed that DNA sample. Now, as the meal came to an end, Ethan made his move. He watched as Lauren wiped her mouth with her napkin and reached for her glass of water. "How do you like working here?" he asked, keeping his tone light. Lauren considered for a moment before answering. "Honestly, it's peaceful. I like being around plants. They don't ask too many questions." Ethan smirked. "Unlike me," she laughed softly, shaking her head. "You're definitely curious." He watched as she took another sip of water, then set the glass down on the table. Now, casually, Ethan leaned forward and reached for the bottle of wine near the center of the table. As he did, he accidentally knocked over his own water glass, the contents spilling across the pristine white tablecloth. "Damn it," he muttered. Lauren immediately reached for her own glass to help, but Ethan was faster. He picked it up, subtly wiping the rim with his napkin before setting it aside. "Sorry about that," he said smoothly. "Let me have James take care of it." Lauren waved it off. "No worries. Accidents happen." Ethan gave a small nod, his mind already racing. The glass was his now. The DNA sample he needed was on it. By tomorrow, he would send it to the lab, and soon, very soon, he would have the truth. As Lauren excused herself for the night, completely unaware of what had just happened, Ethan sat back in his chair, staring at the empty glass. His hands were steady, his breathing was even, but inside, he felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into the unknown, because if that test came back positive, his entire world was about to change forever. Ethan barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind replayed the dinner, the conversation, the way Lauren hesitated when talking about her past. More than once, he found himself staring at the glass on his desk, the delicate fingerprint smudged against the smooth surface. That tiny object held the answer to the question that had tormented him for 19 years. By morning, he had made the arrangements. The sample had been sent to a private lab he trusted, with strict instructions for urgency, no names, no identifiers, just the sample, and a request for immediate processing. Within days, he would have an answer, and then everything would change, despite the storm raging inside him. Ethan forced himself to maintain his usual composure. He dressed as he always did, in a crisp suit that spoke of power and control, and made his way downstairs. But his steps faltered when he caught sight of Lauren through the wide glass doors leading to the garden. She was standing by the roses, sunlight filtering through her hair, her expression thoughtful. There was something almost painfully familiar about the way she tilted her head slightly as she observed the flowers, as if she were lost in another world, just like Emily used to do. His chest tightened. It has to be her. It has to. Forcing himself to breathe evenly, he stepped outside. Lauren turned at the sound of his footsteps, blinking in surprise before offering him a small smile. "Mr. Carter," she greeted. "Out for a morning stroll?" Ethan studied her carefully. "Something like that. You seem deep in thought." Lauren let out a soft chuckle, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I guess I was just thinking about..." She hesitated, then sighed. "Last night." Ethan's heart pounded. "What about it?" Lauren glanced away, looking almost embarrassed. "I don't know, it's just... You asked me about my past, and I realized how little I actually remember. I've never really thought about it much before, but now it's like there's this empty space in my head where memories should be." Ethan forced himself to remain calm. "And that bothers you?" Lauren chewed on her lower lip for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, it does," she exhaled. "I guess I just told myself that whatever happened before the orphanage didn't matter. But now, I wonder, what if I was someone else? What if I had a whole life that I don't even know about?" Ethan's fingers curled into fists at his sides. "You did. You had a family. You had me. Instead," he said, "maybe the past has a way of catching up with us." Lauren met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Maybe," before he could say anything else. The sharp sound of heels clicking against the stone path interrupted them. "Rebecca." Ethan tensed as his sister approached, her usual poised smile plastered on her face. She barely spared Lauren a glance before turning to Ethan. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said smoothly. Lauren took a small step back. "I should get back to work." Ethan wanted to stop her, but he knew pushing too hard would only make her more suspicious. He gave her a nod, watching as she walked away before turning his full attention to Rebecca. "What do you want?" he asked flatly. Rebecca feigned a look of mild offense. "Is that any way to greet your sister?" Ethan wasn't in the mood for her games. "Cut to the chase, Rebecca." Her lips curled slightly, but there was an edge to her amusement. "I just wanted to check in. You seemed troubled yesterday." She tilted her head. "Still chasing ghosts?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "What are you really asking?" Rebecca sighed, stepping closer, lowering her voice. "Ethan, listen to me. You need to let this go. This girl, Lauren, she's just a gardener. That's all she is." His muscles locked. "And you know that for certain, do you?" Rebecca didn't falter. "Yes. Because if Emily were alive, don't you think she would have been found by now?" She paused, her voice softening in mock sympathy. "I know you want her to be alive, but wanting something doesn't make it real." Ethan studied her, watching the way she carefully controlled her expression, how she delivered each word with precision. She was lying. He didn't know how much she knew, or how deep this went, but he felt it. His sister had something to hide. For years he had buried his suspicions under grief, under guilt. But now, standing before her, watching the careful way she manipulated the conversation, he saw the truth for what it was. And when the DNA results came back, he would have the proof to tear her world apart. But for now, he forced himself to remain calm. "You're probably right," he said evenly, watching her reaction closely. "Maybe I've been chasing ghosts for too long." Rebecca's smile widened slightly, but there was something too satisfied in her expression. "It's for the best," she said. "You deserve peace, Ethan. You should stop looking for something that isn't there." Ethan nodded, giving her nothing. But inside he was seething, because in just a few days, he would have the truth. And when he did, Rebecca would regret every single lie she ever told. Ethan had always been a man of control, but today, patience felt like an unbearable weight pressing against his chest. The minutes stretched endlessly as he awaited the call that could change everything. He had spent years bracing himself for disappointment, for another dead end. But this time, something in his gut told him the outcome would be different. As the morning sun filtered through his office window, he stood near his desk, staring at his phone as if willing it to ring. His mind kept replaying the previous night's conversation with Rebecca, the way she had insisted so desperately, that Lauren was just a gardener, the carefully measured concern in her voice, the way she had urged him to let go. It was all too deliberate. Rebecca had always been skilled at manipulation, but Ethan knew her better than anyone. She only pushed this hard when she had something to lose. A sharp vibration on his desk jolted him from his thoughts. His phone. He snatched it up without hesitation. Andrews. The detective's voice came through the line, steady and professional. The results came in. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears. And a brief pause. Then, "It's her, Ethan. Lauren is Emily." The air left his lungs in a rush. His grip on the phone tightened as he struggled to process the weight of those words. He had known it. Deep down, he had known it. But hearing it confirmed was something else entirely. Emily was alive, and Rebecca had lied. Ethan forced himself to speak, his voice rough. "I need everything, Andrews. I need to know how she got from here to an orphanage in the middle of nowhere. Who took her? Who made sure she was never found?" Andrews sighed. "I've already started digging, but Ethan, it's looking bad." A bitter laugh escaped him. "It's been bad for 19 years. "Yeah, well, it's about to get worse," Andrews said grimly. "Someone buried this story so deep that I had to pull records from sources no one should be able to access. There were falsified reports, missing files. Whoever did this had power, real power, and if I had to guess, they're close to you." Ethan's grip on the phone turned to iron. "Rebecca, it's possible," Andrews admitted, "but we need solid proof. If she was involved." She covered her tracks well. No obvious links to the adoption. No direct connection to the orphanage. But there's something else. Ethan braced himself. "What?" "The first detective assigned to Emily's case all those years ago. Detective Paulson. He retired early, moved out of the city. I tracked him down, and he refused to talk at first, like he was scared." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Did he say anything useful?" "He hinted," Andrews said. "Told me the case was taken from him before he could do any real investigating. Files were sealed. Orders came from above, and he was told to drop it or lose his job." Ethan's blood turned to ice. "Who gave the order?" Andrews hesitated. "That's the thing, officially. No name, just an internal directive. But Paulson slipped something before hanging up, said I should look inside the family." Ethan closed his eyes, a slow, simmering rage building in his chest. "Inside the family. Rebecca." He ended the call and exhaled through clenched teeth. His sister had done this. She had known all along. Emily had been alive, out there in the world, and Rebecca had made sure Ethan never found her. For what? Greed, power, revenge, for something twisted inside her own mind. His hands trembled as he reached for a crystal glass of whiskey on his desk. Taking a slow sip to steady himself, he needed a plan. Bursting into Rebecca's room and demanding answers wouldn't work. She would deny everything, twist the narrative like she always did. No, he needed evidence. But most of all, he needed to protect Emily. Lauren, she still didn't know. She had no idea that her entire life had been built on a lie, that her real father had spent nearly 2 decades searching for her. If Rebecca had gone this far to keep the truth buried, there was no telling what she would do now. That Ethan was getting closer. He had to act fast. Ethan pushed away from his desk and strode toward the door, his pulse a steady drum of determination. He found Lauren in the back garden, crouched near the flower beds, her fingers gently tending to the petals of a bright yellow daffodil. The sight was so painfully familiar. Emily had loved flowers too. She looked up at his approach, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "Mr. Carter," she greeted, though there was a slight hesitation in her voice. "You look different today." Ethan wasn't sure what she saw in his expression, but he forced a small smile. "I need to talk to you," he said, keeping his voice steady. Lauren sat back on her heels, tilting her head slightly. "About what?" He hesitated. He couldn't tell her yet. Not until he had more. Not until she was safe. "Would you have dinner with me again tonight?" he asked instead. "I'd like to talk to you properly." Lauren blinked, clearly surprised. Sure, yeah. Good." He nodded, keeping his features calm. "I'll see you later then." She gave him a cautious smile before turning back to her flowers. But Ethan barely noticed, because he could feel it. The walls of Rebecca's lies were about to come crashing down, and this time, there would be no escape. Ethan Carter had always been a man who thrived in control. He built an empire by making precise, calculated moves, by understanding people's weaknesses before they even realized they had them. But tonight, as he sat at the long dining table waiting for Lauren, he felt something unfamiliar: restlessness. The DNA results had confirmed what his heart already knew. Lauren was Emily, his daughter, his little girl who had been stolen from him nearly 2 decades ago, and now she was right in front of him. Completely unaware of the truth that had been buried beneath a lifetime of lies, he had no idea how to tell her. How could he look into her eyes and tell her that her entire life had been a fabrication, that her family, her childhood, everything she thought she knew about herself, was false? A part of him wanted to delay it, to wait until he had more evidence against Rebecca, until he could make sure that Lauren would be safe. But every second that passed, the weight of secrecy grew heavier. Then, the door to the dining room opened. Lauren stepped inside hesitantly, her expression uncertain but polite. She was dressed simply, her hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders, her fingers twitching slightly as if she wasn't sure she should be here. "You sure you want to make a habit out of this?" she asked with a small, nervous chuckle. "People might start thinking I'm more than just the gardener." Ethan managed a small smile, though his mind was anything but at ease. "I think I can handle a few rumors." She sat across from him, her eyes flickering over the elegant table setting before settling on him. "You said you wanted to talk?" Ethan nodded, reaching for the glass of water in front of him just to give his hands something to do. "Yes, there are some things I need to ask you, and I need you to be honest with me." Lauren frowned slightly but nodded. "Of course." He exhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. "You mentioned before that you don't remember anything from before you were found. No memories at all." Lauren hesitated. "Not really, like I said, just flashes, a house, a staircase. Sometimes I think I hear voices in dreams, but I don't recognize them." Ethan's grip tightened around his glass. "Have you ever looked into your past? Tried to find out where you really came from?" Lauren's expression darkened slightly, and she let out a small, hollow laugh. "I did, once, when I was a teenager. I asked my parents, well, my adoptive parents, if they had any information about my birth family. They didn't. And when I started looking into records myself, I found nothing. It was like I just appeared one day." Ethan's throat felt tight, because that was exactly what had happened. Lauren shook her head. "Eventually, I stopped searching. What was the point? Whoever I was before. They obviously didn't want me." Ethan flinched. "That's not true," he said, his voice suddenly sharper than intended. Lauren blinked at him, startled by his intensity. "I mean, I don't know that, do I?" she said carefully. "I was abandoned." "You weren't abandoned," Ethan said, his jaw tight. Lauren let out a breath, clearly confused. "How do you know that?" Ethan stared at her, at the eyes that were so painfully familiar, at the way she furrowed her brows just like Emily used to when she was confused. He had spent 19 years grieving a daughter he thought was lost forever, and now she was sitting in front of him, unknowingly carrying the weight of Rebecca's betrayal. He had to tell her. But before he could say another word, the door to the dining room swung open. "Rebecca," Ethan's muscles locked as his sister walked in, draped in one of her expensive designer dresses, her heels clicking against the floor like a metronome of impending destruction. She cast a quick glance at Lauren before turning her attention to Ethan. "Apologies for the interruption," she said smoothly. "I wasn't aware we were hosting our staff for private dinners now." Lauren shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but Ethan didn't take his eyes off Rebecca. His patience was wearing dangerously thin. "This isn't your concern," he said, his voice like steel. Rebecca let out a small, mocking laugh. "Isn't it? I think I have every right to be concerned when my brother starts forming attachments to people who, let's be honest, shouldn't be sitting at this table." Lauren's eyes flickered with unease, and she pushed her chair back slightly. "Maybe I should go." Ethan reached out, his voice firm but calm. "Stay." Lauren hesitated but sat back down. Rebecca's eyes darkened. "Ethan, you need to let this go," she said in a quieter voice, her tone dropping into something more dangerous. "Whatever it is you think you're doing, You don't want to go down this path? Ethan's jaw clenched. What path is that? Rebecca took a step closer. The one that leads to nothing but pain. A tense silence filled the room. Ethan slowly stood, his gaze never leaving his sister's. I know what you did. Rebecca didn't flinch. She had spent years perfecting the art of control. But there was a flicker, just a flicker, of something in her expression, a crack in the facade. I don't know what you're talking about, she said smoothly. Ethan's lips curled into something cold. You will. Rebecca's jaw tightened, but she quickly masked it with a practiced smile. You're exhausting. Ethan, she said lightly, turning to Lauren. I hope you don't let my brother fill your head with nonsense. He has a way of seeing things that aren't really there. Lauren looked between them, obviously uncomfortable, before standing. I should really go. Ethan clenched his fists but nodded. He wasn't going to drag her into this. Not until he was ready to tear Rebecca apart. Lauren gave him a small, uncertain look before turning and leaving the room. Rebecca exhaled dramatically. That was awkward, wasn't it? Ethan took a slow step forward, lowering his voice so only she could hear. You took my daughter from me. Rebecca's smirk faltered. Ethan leaned in, his voice now a whisper of pure fury. And I'm going to make sure you pay for every second of the 19 years she lost. For the first time in a long time, Rebecca looked nervous. And Ethan knew then, without a doubt, he was getting close. The night air was crisp as Lauren walked through the gardens, her arms wrapped around herself as if shielding against a chill she couldn't quite shake. Something about that dinner had unsettled her, but she couldn't put her finger on why. It wasn't just Rebecca's presence, though the woman had made her feel like an intruder in her own skin. It was Ethan. He'd looked at her differently tonight, not with the detached politeness she expected from a man like him, but with something intense, something undeniably personal. And when he had spoken, when he had told her she wasn't abandoned, there had been something in his voice that made her feel like he knew something she didn't. Lauren shook her head, trying to push the thought away. Maybe she was reading too much into it. Maybe Ethan Carter was just a man with a guilty conscience, someone who saw too much of his past in the people around him. Or maybe he knew the truth. She exhaled, letting her footsteps slow. The estate was quiet, the kind of eerie silence that only vast, empty spaces could create. She had grown used to it by now, the feeling of being small in a place so grand. But tonight, something felt different. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She wasn't alone. The moment the realization hit, it was already too late. A hand clamped over her mouth, and an iron grip wrapped around her waist, yanking her backward before she could scream. Lauren's eyes widened in panic as she thrashed, her nails clawing at the arm around her, her legs kicking wildly. But her attacker was stronger, dragging her swiftly into the shadows. The last thing she saw before darkness consumed her was the faint glow of the mansion's lights in the distance. Ethan was still standing in the dining room, staring at the door Lauren had walked through. His fists were clenched so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. He had seen it, the way Rebecca's expression had shifted when he confronted her. It had been subtle, almost imperceptible, but it had been there. She was scared, which meant she knew the truth. Ethan's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. He snatched it up, expecting Andrew's. But the moment he saw the caller ID, his stomach dropped. Unknown number. A cold sense of dread settled over him as he pressed the phone to his ear. Carter, he answered. His voice clipped. A deep, gravelly voice came through the line. If you want the girl to stay alive, you'll stop digging. Ethan's breath caught. His body went rigid. Lauren, the world around him blurred as raw, unfiltered rage surged through his veins. Where is she? His voice was deadly calm, but the fury underneath it was suffocating. The man on the other end let out a low chuckle. That's not how this works, Carter. You back off, you stop looking, and maybe she makes it out of this alive. Ethan's grip on the phone tightened so much that the plastic threatened to snap. If you hurt her, you'll what? The voice sneered. You're powerful, Carter, but you're not untouchable. You keep pushing, and she disappears forever, just like last time. The line went dead. Ethan stood there for a moment, staring at the phone in his hand, his entire body thrumming with barely restrained fury. Then, without thinking, He hurled it across the room. The device shattered against the wall, pieces clattering to the floor. Rebecca. This was her doing. She was desperate now, reckless. She had spent 19 years burying the truth, and now that it was slipping through her fingers, she was willing to do anything to keep it hidden. But she had made a mistake. She had taken the wrong person. Ethan spun around, storming out of the dining room and into the hallway. His mind was already working through the possibilities. Who had taken her? Where had they gone? And more importantly, how the hell was he going to find her before it was too late? He needed Andrews. Now, Lauren's heart pounded as she blinked against the darkness, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The fabric tied around her eyes was thick, blocking out all light, and the ropes around her wrists cut into her skin every time she moved. She was in the back of a vehicle. She could feel the vibrations of the road beneath her, the hum of an engine, the occasional bump that sent her body lurching against the hard surface. Panic clawed at her throat, but she forced herself to think, who had taken her, and why? Ethan. It had to be connected to him, the way he had looked at her, the questions he had asked, the way Rebecca had hated her for no reason. Something was wrong. Lauren shifted slightly, testing the strength of the knots around her wrists. Tight, too tight to slip free. But her legs were loose. If she could just... The vehicle jerked to a sudden stop. Lauren barely had time to process what was happening before the door was yanked open and rough hands grabbed her. Pulling her out into the cold night air, she stumbled as her feet hit the ground, her body unsteady from the hours spent in the cramped space. "Move," a voice ordered. She was shoved forward, the gravel crunching beneath her feet. "Where are you taking me?" she demanded, her voice hoarse. No answer. A door creaked open and suddenly, she was being dragged inside. The air here was damp, musty, filled with the scent of oil and rust. A warehouse, a basement. She couldn't tell. Then, the blindfold was ripped away. Lauren blinked rapidly, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. A man stood in front of her. Tall, broad-shouldered, his face hidden behind a mask. Behind him, another figure loomed near a table covered in weapons, knives, a gun, a coil of rope. Her stomach twisted violently. "You're in the middle of something you don't understand, girl," the masked man said. "You need to stop asking questions." Lauren's pulse pounded in her ears. "I don't even know what questions to ask," she whispered. The man exhaled, shaking his head. "Then maybe we need to make sure you never get the chance to." Terror wrapped around her like a vice. But deep inside, something else stirred. She wasn't going to die here. She didn't know what was happening. But she knew one thing. Ethan Carter was not a man who let things go if she was right. If he really was hiding something, if he really knew who she was, then he would come for her. And when he did, hell was coming with him. Ethan Carter had always believed that the world operated on a simple principle. Power belonged to those ruthless enough to take it. He had built his empire with that mindset, never hesitating, never allowing emotions to cloud his judgment. But tonight, none of that mattered, because someone had taken his daughter. He stormed through the corridors of his mansion, his mind working at a relentless pace. He had spent nearly 2 decades imagining what he would do if he ever found Emily, if he ever got her back. But he had never envisioned this. They had stolen her once. They wouldn't take her from him again. By the time he reached his office, his hands were shaking, not with fear, but with a rage so profound it felt like it might consume him whole. His phone was already ringing before he even finished dialing. "Andrews. Lauren's been taken," Ethan said. His voice clipped, controlled. "Dangerous." A pause, then. "Who?" "The girl I had you look into. The one who..." Ethan exhaled sharply. "She's Emily Andrews. The DNA test came back. It's her." Andrews cursed under his breath. "Jesus Christ!" Ethan forced himself to stay focused. "They called me, told me to back off the investigation or she dies." Andrews was quiet for a moment. "You think it's Rebecca?" Ethan clenched his jaw. "I don't think, I know. There was no one else with the means, the connections, the absolute desperation to keep the truth buried. Rebecca had orchestrated this from the beginning. And now that she was losing control, she was trying to erase her mistakes. Permanently." Andrews sighed. "I'll start making calls. I have some contacts that deal with cases like this." Off the record, people, if she's being held somewhere, we'll find her." "That's not fast enough," Ethan snapped. "We don't have time." He was already reaching for his jacket, grabbing his keys. He wasn't going to sit in this goddamn house and wait. "You're going after her," Andrews said. And it wasn't a question. "I don't need you to tell me how reckless this is," Ethan said as he strode toward the garage. "I need you to tell me where." Andrews hesitated, then exhaled sharply. "Fine. There's an old warehouse district near the docks. Abandoned years ago, if I had to guess. That's where they'd take her. Far enough from the city that no one asks questions, but close enough for a quick escape if things go south." Ethan didn't need to hear anything else. He was already on his way. Lauren's wrists burned against the rough rope, but she kept twisting, kept moving. She refused to sit there and let herself be some helpless victim. The two men guarding her weren't paying attention to her anymore, too busy talking in hushed voices near the entrance of what looked like an old warehouse. She had caught pieces of their conversation, mentions of the boss and waiting for the call, but nothing useful. She didn't know how long she had been here, minutes, hours, but one thing she did know: Ethan would come. She didn't understand why, but she felt it in her bones, the way he had looked at her, the way he had known things about her past that she didn't even know herself. He was connected to this somehow, and when he found out she was missing, he wouldn't just sit back and do nothing. She just had to hold on. The men's voices lowered even more, and Lauren took the risk of shifting slightly, trying to loosen the ropes binding her hands behind her back. She winced as the coarse fibers scraped her skin, but she gritted her teeth and kept going. Then, footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. Lauren barely had time to react before a new figure stepped into the dim light. Rebecca. Her blood ran cold. The woman's heels clicked against the concrete floor as she approached, her expression carefully neutral, but there was something in her eyes, a quiet, simmering calculation. "You have no idea what kind of mess you've stumbled into," Rebecca said, her tone light, almost amused. Lauren didn't answer. Rebecca crouched in front of her, tilting her head slightly. "I warned Ethan to let this go, but my brother never was good at listening." Lauren swallowed hard. "Why are you doing this?" Rebecca sighed. "Because you're a problem, and problems need to be dealt with before they become disasters." Lauren's stomach twisted. "I don't even know who I am," she said, her voice shaking despite her best efforts. "Why does it matter?" Rebecca's gaze darkened. "Because ignorance is bliss. And you were never supposed to remember." Lauren's breath hitched before she could press further. The sound of gunfire exploded in the distance. Rebecca's head snapped up. The men near the door immediately reached for their weapons, barking orders into their radios. Lauren's heart raced. He was here. Ethan Carter was coming. Rebecca muttered a curse under her breath before looking back at Lauren, something dangerous flashing in her eyes. "It's too late for you now," she murmured. "You should have stayed a ghost." Then, without hesitation, she pulled out a knife. Lauren barely had time to react before Rebecca lunged, but at that exact moment, the warehouse doors burst open. A figure emerged through the haze of dust and smoke, a gun raised, eyes burning with pure fury. Ethan, and he looked like a man ready to burn the world down. Ethan Carter had never felt rage like this before. It was a fire in his veins, a beast clawing at his chest, demanding retribution. The moment he stepped into the warehouse, his eyes locked onto Rebecca, his own sister, holding a knife to Lauren's throat. His heart slammed against his ribs at the sight, his grip tightening around the gun in his hand. "Let her go," Ethan said, his voice deadly calm. Rebecca's lips curled into a smirk, but there was a flicker of unease in her eyes. "You're making a mistake, Ethan." Lauren's breath was shaky, but she held her chin high, refusing to show fear. Ethan had never been prouder of her than in that moment. "The only mistake was letting you walk free all these years," Ethan said, taking a slow, measured step forward. The sound of the safety clicking off his gun echoed through the warehouse behind Rebecca. Her men hesitated, uncertainty flickering across their faces. They weren't expecting him to find them so fast, and they sure as hell weren't expecting this version of Ethan Carter. "You think you can fix this?" Rebecca scoffed. "She's already too deep. She knows too much." Ethan took another step forward, his aim never wavering. "Then maybe you should start praying, Rebecca. Because if you don't put that knife down, you won't leave this warehouse alive." For the first time, Rebecca's smirk faltered. Lauren took the opportunity. With a sudden twist, she yanked her body sideways, throwing Rebecca off balance just enough for the knife to slip from her grasp. It clattered against the concrete floor, and in the same heartbeat, Ethan fired. The bullet whizzed past Rebecca's shoulder, grazing her arm. She screamed, staggering backward, clutching at the wound. Chaos erupted. Rebecca's men snapped out of their hesitation, reaching for their weapons, but Ethan was faster. He dropped the first one with a clean shot to the knee, sending him crashing to the ground with a scream. The second lunged toward Lauren, but she was ready. She slammed her elbow into his ribs and kicked out his knee, making him collapse with a grunt of pain. Ethan moved through the fight like a man possessed, taking down one after another with brutal efficiency. This wasn't some boardroom negotiation. This wasn't some cold, calculated business deal. This was war. Lauren fought beside him, her instincts sharp despite the fear in her eyes. Ethan caught glimpses of her between shots. The way she moved, the way she reacted, the way she refused to give in. She was his daughter, and she was a fighter. Rebecca was trying to crawl toward a discarded gun, her breath ragged, blood staining the sleeve of her expensive blouse. Ethan reached her first. He kicked the gun away and grabbed her by the collar, yanking her up so their faces were inches apart. "Where the hell were you going to take her?" he growled. Rebecca spat at his feet, her eyes burning with hatred. "You think this ends here?" she hissed. "You have no idea how deep this goes, Ethan. You don't know the people I had to deal with to make this happen." Ethan's grip tightened. "You took my daughter from me." Rebecca laughed. Actually laughed, despite the pain. "And yet here she is, alive and well. Maybe you should be thanking me." Ethan slammed her against the nearest metal beam, making her gasp. "You destroyed her life," he seethed. "You stole her from me, erased her past, made her grow up believing she was nothing." Rebecca's expression twisted into something cruel. "And what are you going to do about it, brother?" Ethan's finger twitched on the trigger. It would be so easy. One shot, one clean shot, and this would be over. But then, a small voice, shaken but firm, cut through the haze of his fury. "Dad." Ethan froze. His breath stilled. Slowly, he turned his head. Lauren stood a few feet away, her chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. There was a raw vulnerability in her expression, a mix of realization and fear. She had said it without thinking, but it had slipped out. Rebecca's smirk widened. "Well, there it is," she taunted. "She knows." Ethan let go of Rebecca so fast that she crumpled to the ground. He turned fully to Lauren, his pulse hammering in his ears. Lauren took a step back. "Is it true?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Am I your daughter?" Ethan's throat was dry. His mind was spinning, grasping for the right words. But nothing came, because how did he even begin to explain? "Yes," he finally managed, his voice hoarse. "You're Emily." Lauren staggered, as if the ground beneath her had been ripped away. She shook her head, her breathing uneven. "No, that's not." She let out a shaky laugh, but there was no humor in it. "I don't..." Ethan took a cautious step toward her. "I had a DNA test done," he admitted. "I had to be sure, and I am." Lauren's eyes filled with something unreadable. "You tested my DNA. It was the only way to know for sure." She swallowed hard, looking away. "So, all this time, you knew?" Ethan exhaled slowly. "Not for long, but when I saw you, that pendant, I suspected." Lauren touched the necklace unconsciously, then dropped her hand as if it burned. "This is insane," she whispered. Ethan could see it, the way her mind was spiraling, the way she was struggling to make sense of everything. She needed time, and time was the one thing they didn't have. Sirens wailed in the distance. "Andrews," Ethan forced himself to focus. He turned back to Rebecca, who was trying to crawl toward an exit. Without hesitation, he grabbed her by the wrist and yanked her back. "You're not going anywhere," he growled. Rebecca laughed, even as pain twisted her features. "You think you've won? You don't even know who the real enemy is." "Ethan!" Ethan yanked her up, dragging her toward the warehouse entrance. "Then let's find out." The sirens grew louder, red and blue lights flashing against the rusted metal walls. Rebecca's reign of terror was over. But Ethan knew this was just the beginning. He turned to Lauren one last time, his voice firm despite the storm raging inside him. "I know this is a lot," he said, "but no matter what happens next, you are not alone in this." Lauren hesitated. Then, after a long moment, she whispered, "I don't know who I am anymore." Ethan's chest tightened. "You're my daughter," he said softly, "and that's never changed." The police flooded into the warehouse, and Ethan Carter knew this war wasn't over yet. The police lights flickered against the cold metal walls of the warehouse, their rhythmic glow casting sharp shadows across the scene. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, blood, and gasoline, the remnants of the struggle still lingering in the space. Officers moved swiftly, their voices blending into a dull hum. But for Ethan Carter, the world had narrowed to one thing: Lauren. She stood just a few feet away, arms wrapped around herself, her expression distant. She had barely spoken since the revelation, her mind still trapped in the storm of realization. Emily, his daughter, she was alive. She was right there, but she wasn't his. Not yet. Ethan wanted to reach out, to hold her, to reassure her that everything would be all right. But how could he promise that when she had just discovered her entire life had been a lie? Rebecca was being dragged toward a police car, her wrists cuffed tightly behind her back. Even now, she carried herself with an air of defiance, like a woman who still believed she could win. "You can lock me up," she murmured, as Ethan stepped closer, her voice just low enough for him to hear. "But you have no idea what you've started, brother." Ethan's jaw clenched. "You're done, Rebecca." She let out a dry chuckle, shaking her head. "You still don't see it, do you? This was never just about me. I was only a piece of the puzzle." She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice even more. "You think I did all of this alone?" Ethan's blood ran cold. Rebecca smirked at his reaction. "You should have let her stay lost," she whispered. "Now you've made enemies you can't even name." "Who?" Ethan demanded, his voice like steel. "Who helped you?" Rebecca just smiled, her lips curving into something smug, something dangerous. "You'll find out soon enough," she said. "And when you do, don't say I didn't warn you." The officers pulled her away, shoving her into the back of the squad car. The door slammed shut, sealing her inside. But Ethan didn't move. His mind was racing. What the hell had she meant? His gut told him this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But right now, the biggest battle wasn't against whoever was still out there. It was standing just a few feet away from him, looking at him like he was a stranger. Lauren. She was watching him now, her gaze wary, guarded. He knew that look. It was the look of someone trying to decide whether to run or fight. He took a careful step toward her. "Lauren." She flinched. It was small, barely noticeable, but it gutted him. She shook her head, letting out a shaky breath. I can't do this right now." Ethan's chest tightened. "I know this is a lot," he said carefully. "I don't expect you to process everything overnight." She let out a hollow laugh, rubbing her arms. "You don't understand," she murmured. "I don't even know who I am anymore." Ethan swallowed hard. "You're Emily," he said softly. "You're my daughter." Lauren's gaze snapped to his, something pained flickering in her eyes. "No," she whispered. "I'm Lauren. That's who I've been my whole life. And now, you're telling me that none of that was real." Ethan exhaled, his hands flexing at his sides. "It was real," he said. "Your life, your memories, they're all yours. But there was more, a past that was stolen from you." Lauren shook her head again, stepping back. "You don't get it," she said, her voice unsteady. "You've had 19 years to grieve, to search, but me..." She let out a breath, almost laughing bitterly. "I didn't even know I was missing. I didn't feel lost, and now, suddenly, I have this..." She gestured between them, her expression filled with conflict. "This history I don't remember. A father I don't know." Ethan felt something inside him crack. She wasn't rejecting him. Not yet. But she was scared. And after everything she had been through tonight, how could he blame her? "Lauren," he said, his voice steady. "I don't expect you to accept this right away. I don't expect you to call me Dad tomorrow." He exhaled, searching for the right words. "I just want you to know, I'm not going anywhere." Lauren swallowed, her throat bobbing. I don't know what to do with that. You don't have to do anything right now, Ethan said. You just have to breathe, one step at a time. She was silent for a long moment. Then finally, she nodded. It was small, hesitant, but it was something. Ethan didn't push, he wanted to. God, he wanted to pull her into his arms, to tell her that everything was going to be okay, but she wasn't ready. So, for now, he would wait. A few feet away, Andrews approached. We need to get her somewhere safe, he said quietly, his gaze flicking between them. This isn't over, if Rebecca was telling the truth. We don't know who else is involved. Ethan nodded, his mind shifting back into protector mode. She stays with me. Lauren's eyes widened slightly. What? You're not safe, Ethan said firmly. Not until we know who else is behind this. Lauren hesitated, clearly torn, but then she sighed. Fine, she muttered. But this doesn't mean I trust you yet. Ethan's lips twitched at that. I can live with that. Andrews smirked slightly. Looks like you've got your work cut out for you, Carter. Ethan already knew that. But after 19 years of searching, after years of believing his daughter was gone forever, he would take whatever time she needed. Because now, she was home. Even if she didn't realize it yet, the car ride back to the estate was cloaked in silence. Ethan drove with a steady hand, his expression unreadable, but his mind was anything but calm. Every few minutes, he would glance at Lauren through the rearview mirror, watching the way she kept her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Staring blankly out the window, she hadn't spoken much since agreeing to come with him. Not that he blamed her. Her entire world had shattered in a matter of hours. Ethan wanted to give her space, to let her process things at her own pace. But every second that passed without hearing her voice felt like another second lost. Another moment where she slipped further away from him. And after everything, he couldn't lose her again. When they finally pulled up to the mansion, the estate was eerily quiet. The security had been doubled. He had made sure of that the moment Lauren was taken. But even with the added precautions, he felt an itch in his bones. Rebecca wasn't working alone. And until he figured out who else was involved, Lauren was still a target. She hesitated before stepping out of the car, her eyes trailing up the grand facade of the house, as if she were seeing it for the first time. Big place, she muttered under her breath. Ethan managed a small smile. You used to love playing in the hallways when you were little, he said. Always running, always hiding. Lauren tensed slightly, but didn't look at him. I don't remember. His chest tightened, but he nodded. I know. They walked inside together, the warmth of the house a stark contrast to the cold weight sitting between them. James, his ever-loyal butler, was waiting in the foyer, his gaze flickering briefly to Lauren, before settling on Ethan. Everything is secure, sir, James said smoothly. The guest room has been prepared. Ethan shook his head. She's not staying in the guest room, he said firmly. Set up one of the bedrooms in the west wing. She stays close to me. Lauren's brows shot up. I'm not a prisoner, she said sharply. Ethan turned to her, his gaze steady. You're not, but you're not safe either. Lauren exhaled through her nose, clearly frustrated but too tired to argue. Fine, she muttered. James nodded and disappeared down the hall to make the arrangements. Ethan turned back to Lauren, his voice softer. You should get some rest. You've been through a lot. She gave a short, humorless laugh. Yeah, I think that's an understatement. He wanted to say more, to tell her that she wasn't alone in this, that she didn't have to carry the weight of everything by herself, but before he could find the right words. She was already walking past him, following James down the corridor, and for the second time that night, Ethan let her go. Lauren stood in the unfamiliar bedroom, her fingers brushing over the smooth wooden dresser. The space was elegant but simple, nothing too extravagant, just warm and strangely familiar. She wasn't sure how she was supposed to feel. She had grown up believing she had no past before the orphanage, no family, no history, just a blank space where memories should have been. And now, suddenly, she was Emily Carter, the daughter of a man who had been searching for her his entire life. It didn't feel real. She turned toward the mirror on the wall, staring at her own reflection. Who was she? Lauren? Emily? Or someone in between? Her fingers unconsciously reached for the pendant around her neck, the one thing she had always carried with her. And now she knew why. A quiet knock on the door snapped her out of her thoughts. She turned to see Ethan standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I didn't mean to disturb you," he said. "I just wanted to check on you." Lauren swallowed, unsure of what to say. After a moment, she sighed. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, watching her carefully. "You don't have to figure it all out tonight." She let out a bitter laugh. "That's easy for you to say. You've had time to process all of this, I haven't." Ethan hesitated. Then, after a moment, he stepped further into the room. "I won't pretend to understand how hard this is for you," he said. "But I meant what I said back there. I'm not going anywhere." Lauren looked at him then, really looked at him. There was something in his eyes, something raw, something aching. She had spent so much time feeling alone, feeling like she had no one. But now, standing in front of her, was a man who had spent 19 years looking for her. A man who had never given up, and that scared her more than anything. "Good night, Ethan," she said quietly. Ethan's expression remained steady, but she saw the flicker of emotion in his gaze. "Good night, Lauren," he said, and with that, he turned and walked away, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She lay down on the massive bed, staring up at the ceiling. Sleep didn't come easily because no matter how much she tried to ignore it, one thought wouldn't leave her mind. What if she wasn't supposed to remember? What if the past she was chasing was something better left buried? Ethan barely slept. He sat in his study long after the house had gone quiet, the weight of everything pressing down on him like a storm he couldn't outrun. The whiskey in his glass remained untouched, his fingers gripping the crystal as he stared out the massive window overlooking the darkened estate. Lauren, Emily, was finally home. But she wasn't his yet. She was confused, lost, trying to piece together an identity that had been stolen from her. And he couldn't blame her for that. How could he expect her to embrace a past she didn't even remember? But he wasn't going to lose her. Not again. The problem was Rebecca. Her words still echoed in his mind. "You don't even know who the real enemy is." That wasn't just arrogance. That was a warning. Ethan had spent years believing her greed was the reason she orchestrated Emily's disappearance. But if she wasn't working alone, if there were others who had a stake in keeping Emily lost, then this wasn't just about family betrayal anymore. This was about something bigger. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. He turned, already knowing who it was. Andrew stepped inside, his face set in grim determination. "Got something for you," he said, tossing a folder onto Ethan's desk. Ethan leaned forward, flipping it open. Inside were old case files, missing persons reports, all connected to Emily's disappearance. And at the bottom, a document Ethan hadn't seen before. A name stood out. Robert Langley. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Who the hell is this? Andrews pulled out a chair, sitting across from him. "That's the guy who handled the adoption records at the orphanage where Emily was found," he explained. "Back then, I didn't think much of him, just another bureaucrat moving papers. But after Rebecca's little stunt, I went digging." Ethan's grip tightened on the file. "And," Andrews exhaled, "turns out, Langley's been dead for over 15 years. Official cause of death, car accident." Ethan's jaw clenched. "Convenient." "Very," Andrews nodded. "But it gets worse. Before he died, Langley received a large sum of money that came from a private offshore account, completely untraceable. And guess what?" Ethan's heart pounded. "Rebecca's involved." "Not just Rebecca." Andrews leaned in. "This account, it's been linked to other missing children cases, ones that never got solved." Ethan's blood ran cold. "Are you telling me this wasn't just about Emily?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. Andrews met his gaze. "I'm telling you that Rebecca was working with someone else. Someone who's been covering up disappearances for a long time." Ethan's fingers curled into a fist. "Who?" Andrews shook his head. "That's the problem. Whoever's behind this is careful. They used Rebecca as a pawn, but she wasn't the mastermind. The real question is, why? Why go through so much trouble to take Emily? Why make sure she was never found?" Ethan's mind raced. This wasn't just about money. If it were, there would have been a ransom. But Emily wasn't held hostage. She was erased, hidden away in an orphanage, placed into a life where no one would ever find her. This was about something else. and Rebecca knew more than she had let on. Ethan stood abruptly. "I need to see her." Andrews raised a brow. "You sure that's a good idea?" "No," Ethan admitted. "But I don't have time to play it safe. If Rebecca knows something, I'm going to make her talk." Andrews sighed. "I'll make some calls, see if we can arrange a visit." Ethan nodded, his mind already moving ahead, trying to anticipate his sister's next move. Because whatever game she had been playing, she had just lost. And now, it was his turn. Lauren barely touched her breakfast the next morning. She sat in the quiet dining room, absently stirring her coffee, her mind still caught in the whirlwind of the last 24 hours. Emily, that was supposed to be her name. She had said it to herself in the mirror last night, over and over, waiting for it to feel right. But it didn't. It felt like a stranger's name, like something she had read in a book once but couldn't quite recall. She had spent 19 years as Lauren Bennett. That was who she was, wasn't it? The sound of footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. She looked up just as Ethan walked in, his expression unreadable. "You didn't sleep," she noted, taking in the faint shadows under his eyes. He gave her a wry smirk. "Neither did you," she exhaled, setting her spoon down. "I don't know how I'm supposed to just accept this." "You don't have to," Ethan said simply. "Not yet." Lauren studied him, her fingers tightening around her mug. "Why didn't you just tell me the truth from the beginning?" Ethan hesitated. "Because I didn't want to scare you." He leaned against the table, his voice softer now. "I know this is overwhelming, but I also know that deep down, you feel it too." Lauren's pulse quickened. "Feel what?" "That something was missing," Ethan said. "That there were pieces of you that never quite fit." Lauren swallowed. She hated that he was right. She had always felt like she was standing on the outside of her own life, like something was just off. And now she knew why. Before she could respond, Ethan straightened. "I need to go out for a while," he said. "There's something I have to take care of." Lauren frowned. "Is it about Rebecca?" Ethan's expression darkened. "Yes." Lauren hesitated. "She knows something else, doesn't she?" "Yes." A long silence stretched between them. Then, to her own surprise, Lauren asked, "Can I come?" Ethan looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the uncertainty, the fear, but he also saw something else. Strength, determination, and maybe, just maybe, a flicker of trust. He exhaled slowly. "All right," he said. "Let's go." Because if there was one thing Ethan Carter knew, it was that the truth was coming. And no matter how ugly it was, they were going to face it together. The drive to the detention center was tense, filled with a silence that carried more weight than any words could. Lauren sat in the passenger seat, her arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the blurred scenery outside the window. Ethan could feel the conflict radiating from her, the quiet storm of emotions she was trying so desperately to contain. She had agreed to come, but that didn't mean she was ready. Neither of them were. Ethan focused on the road, gripping the wheel tighter than necessary. His mind was locked on one thing: getting answers. Rebecca had orchestrated Emily's disappearance, but she hadn't acted alone. Somewhere in the tangled mess of lies, there was another player, someone powerful enough to bury the truth for nearly 2 decades. And today, he was going to find out who. When they arrived, the gray concrete building loomed ahead, cold and unwelcoming. The guards barely gave Ethan a second glance as they led him and Lauren inside. They knew who he was. Ethan Carter didn't wait in lines. Lauren stayed close to him, though she said nothing. He could tell she was nervous, her fingers fidgeting slightly, but she kept her expression neutral. He had to give her credit. She was handling this far better than he had expected. The guard led them to a small, sterile room with a thick glass partition. On the other side, seated in a metal chair, was Rebecca. She looked different. Gone was the polished elegance, the carefully curated poise. Instead, she looked tired, her hair slightly disheveled, dark circles lining her sharp eyes. But even now, there was something unbroken about her. She smirked when she saw them. "Well, this is a surprise." Ethan didn't waste time. He sat down across from her, his gaze hard. "No games, Rebecca. Who were you working with?" Rebecca leaned back, crossing her arms. Straight to the point, classic Ethan. She glanced at Lauren then, tilting her head slightly. "And you brought her, how sweet." Lauren stiffened, but she didn't look away. "Why did you do it?" Rebecca arched a brow. Do what, exactly? Ethan's patience was razor thin. You stole my daughter, he said, his voice quiet but lethal. You lied to me. You made me believe she was dead. I want to know why. Rebecca sighed, shaking her head. You think this is about money? About inheritance? She let out a hollow laugh. You never saw the bigger picture, Ethan. You never even bothered to look. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Then enlighten me. Rebecca leaned forward slightly, her expression unreadable. You were always the favorite, the perfect son, the heir to everything our family built, and me. I was just the one standing in your shadow. Ethan's jaw clenched. That's your excuse, jealousy. Rebecca's eyes flashed. You still don't get it. She exhaled sharply, as if she were debating whether to even tell him. Then, finally, she said, It wasn't just me, I had orders. Ethan's entire body went rigid. From who? Rebecca smirked. Do you remember our father's business partner, Gerald Whitmore? Ethan felt like the air had been knocked from his lungs. Whitmore, a name he hadn't heard in years. You're lying, he said, though the sinking feeling in his gut told him otherwise. Rebecca shrugged. Believe what you want. But Whitmore and our father weren't just running a business, Ethan. They were part of something bigger. And when Dad died, Whitmore wasn't about to let his legacy fall apart. He needed control. Ethan stared at her, the pieces falling into place in his mind. Emily was a threat. Rebecca gave him a slow, knowing smile. Exactly. She was your only weakness. And Whitmore knew that, if he took her away, made sure you thought she was gone forever, he knew you'd be too broken to fight back. Ethan's hands clenched into fists. And you let it happen. Rebecca didn't even flinch. I did what I had to do. Ethan shot up from his chair, fury boiling inside him. You let me suffer for 19 years, he seethed. You let her suffer. You took a child and threw her away like she meant nothing. Rebecca's expression flickered. Just for a moment, a glimpse of something almost human beneath the cold exterior. Then it was gone. Whitmore wanted her erased, she said. But I didn't let him kill her. That was my choice. Ethan's breath was sharp. And now? Rebecca tilted her head. Now, she smiled. Now you have a bigger problem. Ethan barely heard the sound of the door opening behind him before Andrews stepped inside. His face set in grim urgency. We need to go, Andrews said. Now. Ethan's instincts flared. What happened? Andrews hesitated, then looked at Lauren. They found out she's alive, he said. And they're coming for her. Lauren's breath hitched. Ethan spun back to Rebecca, but she was already leaning back in her chair, a victorious smirk curling her lips. You should have let it go, she murmured. Ethan didn't wait. He grabbed Lauren's wrist and pulled her out of the room. Andrews close behind. His heart was pounding, adrenaline surging through his veins because he had just uncovered the real enemy, and now they were coming for his daughter. But if they thought he would let them take her again, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Ethan moved with purpose, his grip firm around Lauren's wrist as they rushed through the cold corridors of the detention center. The weight of Rebecca's revelation burned inside him, but he didn't have the luxury of time to process it. They were coming, and this time, they wouldn't stop until they erased both of them. Lauren's breathing was unsteady, but she kept up with his pace. He could feel the tension radiating from her, the fear creeping into her eyes. She didn't fully understand the danger yet, but Ethan did, and he wouldn't let them take her again. Andrews led the way, his expression dark with urgency. Security details outside, he said, glancing back at Ethan. We need to move fast. If Whitmore's people know she's alive, they'll be mobilizing. Hard. Ethan didn't need the warning. He knew exactly what kind of man Gerald Whitmore was. Powerful, ruthless, the kind of person who made problems disappear before they could become threats. And now, Emily was his problem. They pushed through the doors into the parking lot where black SUVs were waiting. Ethan wasted no time, ushering Lauren into the back seat and sliding in beside her. Andrews jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut just as the convoy began moving. Lauren finally broke the silence, her voice shaking. Can someone please tell me what the hell is going on? Ethan turned to her, his jaw clenched. The people who took you, they're still out there, and now they know you survived. Lauren swallowed hard. So, what? They're going to try to kill me. Ethan's face was stone. They're going to try, but they won't succeed. The SUV sped down the freeway, headlights cutting through the darkness. Andrews kept his eyes on the road, his tone tense. We need a safe house. Somewhere off-grid, no digital footprint. Whitmore has resources. Too many. Ethan thought fast. The estate was too obvious, too exposed. But there was one place. The cabin, he said. Andrews glanced at him through the rearview mirror. That's a long shot. It's secure, Ethan said firmly. No records? No connections. My father built it years ago for emergencies. Andrews hesitated, then nodded. Fine, we'll head there. But if we're doing this, we need backup. Ethan's grip on his phone tightened. Then call them. Andrews didn't argue. He pulled out his burner phone and started making calls. Lauren leaned forward slightly, her voice quiet but steady. What happens after? Ethan met her gaze. We end this. The cabin was deep in the mountains, hidden behind towering trees and winding dirt roads that most people wouldn't even know existed. It had been built for secrecy, for times when no one could be trusted. And now, it was the safest place they had. Ethan checked the perimeter before leading Lauren inside. The moment she stepped through the door, she exhaled sharply, rubbing her arms. This is insane, she muttered. Yesterday I was just some girl trying to make a living, and now I'm apparently the target of some underground conspiracy. Ethan shut the door behind them, locking it. You were never just some girl, he said. You were taken for a reason, and now we know why. Lauren turned to face him, arms crossed. But I don't remember any of it, she said. I don't remember you. I don't remember Whitmore. It's like my entire childhood was erased. Ethan's expression darkened. Because it was. Lauren's breath caught. But before she could respond, the sound of tires crunching on gravel made Ethan spin toward the window. They were here. Andrews appeared from the hallway, gun already drawn. They found us, Ethan cursed under his breath. How the hell? Lauren's face paled. Rebecca, she whispered. Andrews nodded grimly. They must have gotten to her in holding. She probably gave up the location the second they applied pressure. Ethan's blood boiled. His own sister had delivered them straight into enemy hands. The first gunshot shattered the stillness of the night. Lauren flinched, but Ethan was already moving, grabbing her and pulling her toward the back of the cabin. Stay low, he ordered. Do exactly what I say. She nodded quickly, fear flashing in her eyes. But she didn't argue. Andrews ducked behind the couch, peering through the window. 4 men. Maybe 5. They're moving in fast. Ethan's grip tightened on his weapon. Then we stop them. Bullets ripped through the walls, splintering wood and sending debris flying. The cabin wasn't built for a siege, but it was sturdy enough to buy them time. Ethan moved like a predator, silent. Controlled, he took position near the front door, waiting. The first man breached. Ethan didn't hesitate. One clean shot to the chest, and the man collapsed. Another followed, gun raised. Ethan was faster. He ducked, twisted, and fired, sending the second attacker sprawling onto the floor. Andrews covered the back entrance. Exchanging gunfire with another intruder, Lauren was pressed against the corner, breathing hard, but she stayed still. She wasn't panicking. She was watching, learning. Another shot rang out, and then silence. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the room. Is that all of them? Andrews checked the window, then let out a slow breath. Looks like it. Ethan exhaled, lowering his gun, but his relief was short-lived. Lauren was staring at the bodies, her face pale, her hands trembling. They were trying to kill me, she whispered. Ethan moved toward her, and they failed. She looked up at him, something shifting in her eyes. They're not going to stop, are they? Ethan's jaw tightened. Not until Whitmore is gone. She swallowed hard. Then, before he could stop her, she picked up one of the fallen men's guns. Ethan stiffened. Lauren. She met his gaze, something new burning inside her. I want to end this too. For a long moment, he just stared at her. Then slowly, he nodded, because she wasn't Lauren anymore. She was Emily Carter, and she was ready to fight.